Hello. So I wanted to make a video about this idea of never backing the early kickoff in FPL. I've heard it said a few times. It's like a meme. Gandhi apparently said it, and the idea that you should never back the early kickoff. And I've always just assumed it's like a joke, and it's not really statistically significant. Has no basis in reality. I think I heard that the idea came from the idea that if you captain somebody in the early kickoff, if they don't come through, then the rest of your weekend is ruined because, you have to kind of watch through all the other games and it's just miserable. I think that was the idea, possibly. But then there's this idea of like Klopp hates the early kickoffs, Saturday morning early kickoffs, and this season particularly, there seems to be a lot of shock results and low-scoring results. Brentford just beat Man City 2-1. Everybody had their captains on Haaland and De Bruyne, and they all blanked. Cancelo blanked, and it's all a big disappointment. And Liverpool lost to Nottingham Forest earlier in the season, 1-0, and that was a big disappointment. And I think there was a 0-0 between Liverpool and Everton. So, I had this sense of like, well, maybe there's something to it. Maybe there's actually data that backs it up. Maybe the footballers are like, when do footballers go to bed? I'm assuming it's quite late because they have quite a lot of evening kickoffs, like at 8 o'clock. And if they're in the cup and they go on to extra time and penalties, they might have to stay up until 11, half 10, 11ish, and then they've got to warm down. I'm assuming footballers go to bed at like midnight, at least maybe 1, 2 in the morning, and wake up at 8, 10 in the morning. So it's possible that maybe their body clocks aren't quite attuned for these morning kickoffs, and maybe they are leggy and a bit tired because Man City did look a bit tired at the weekend. Or maybe it's something to do with the Champions League midweek games and then the rollover. I thought there could be something to it. So I wanted to look into the data. And when I first started looking into the data, I started just looking at a few players, and some of them did seem to perform worse in the early kickoffs than in the non-early kickoffs. So I thought there might be something to it. But basically, long story short, I've looked into a whole bunch of data now, and I don't think there's anything statistically significant about it now. Now, I could be wrong, and if anybody's got some better data out there, reasons to think otherwise, please tell me. The sample size is not massively great statistically significant, so it could be that the numbers, I haven't got a big enough sample size, but I don't see anything statistically significant, and I'll go through it in a minute. But yeah, so the data I have is about 5 years worth of the last 5 years of Fantasy Premier League data. And I looked through all these different categories of people. Firstly, I just looked through like all players in the game, how many points they score in the early kickoffs, divided by the number of games. So there's only people who play in the games. Anybody that gets 0 minutes, I've just discounted. And how many points these playing players score. On average, you get about 2.99. And then in the non-early kickoffs, the average is about 2.98. So it's like not much different. I looked at some other metrics like how many goals scored. It's about 0.098, and in how many per game in the early kickoffs, and how many goals are scored in the non-early kickoffs is about the same, 0.096. Not a great deal of difference. Same with goals conceded. Not much difference. But then I started looking into specific categories. So the 10 million, any player who's cost 10 million or more, they have a small drop off of like in the early kickoffs, they get 5.22 points they average, whereas in the non-early kickoffs, they get 5.63. So it's a little bit of a drop off, but the sample size is only 157 games. It's possible that's not a big enough sample size. Pardon me. The amount of goals they score is 0.48 per game, 0.49 in the non-early kickoffs, so not much difference there. Same with goals conceded, not much difference. 8 to 10 million, they have quite a big drop off. I mean, some of this might be statistically significant. I just don't see it when we come into some other categories later. They get like 3.82 points on average in the early kickoffs, whereas they average 4.6 points in the non-early kickoffs. It's a bit of a drop there. Score like a lot, 0.19 goals in the non-early kickoffs, 0.32. Not much difference in the goals conceded. I went through a whole selection of individual players who over the last 5 years have been popular captains. So Salah, Kane, De Bruyne, Son, Sterling, Fernandes, Trent, Cancelo. And out of those 8, 3 of them perform better in the early kickoffs and 5 of them perform worse. And Salah is like not much worse. So it's kind of, again, statistically, the sample size is not very big. I don't really see a great pattern there. The thing that kind of killed it for me though is that when I looked into I started looking into ownership, and you got plus 10% owned, which wasn't very statistically significant difference there at all. 4.29 average points in the early kickoff, and the average 4.3 in the non-early kickoffs. Not a great deal of difference there. And then I looked at all the players who are 30% owned or more, and they perform better, only slightly better, but again, not statistically significant. 5.3 points in the early kickoffs and 5.1 in the non-early kickoffs. And they score slightly more. And this is the category of people who might be considered captains. So that kind of, well, that doesn't fit the pattern. I may have missed something, but it all feels a bit, I thought it was just going to be reds all along. When I started looking into like Salah and De Bruyne and Son getting these big minus reds, I thought, oh look, they were all performing way worse. But then there's a whole bunch of other players who perform better. And when you look at the big picture, it doesn't seem to be that much of a difference. So I think you can back the early kickoff. I think it doesn't make much difference. I think it still feels a bit counterintuitive because the amount of times I've noticed sluggish games in that early kickoff. I mean, the Man City versus Wolves early in the season, I think I captained against Haaland that game because they had the Dortmund game or Champions League game midweek, and Wolves' defence was a bit tough, and I thought maybe they might struggle. And they did struggle a little. I mean, they scored 3 goals, but it's still, if you watch the game, they were very sluggish in that game as well. So I still feel like there may be something to this theory, but these numbers don't back it up. And so for now, I will continue to back early kickoffs, I think. And the idea of it ruining your weekend, I don't really care about. I just want to back whoever is most likely to score the most points in any game week, whether it's the early kickoff or the last kickoff. So yeah, I always think of like a million. I'm sure I had a million other things I was going to say, and I forget when I get to the end of the video. So I'll probably remember it as soon as I stop the video. Anyway, I think that's all I wanted to say. Yeah, back the early kickoff seems to be fine. Don't think there's anything statistically significant about it. Yeah. Okay. Bye bye.